The 6-hour bus ride from Chicago to Willow Creek, Wisconsin, was a real challenge for my weary 68-year-old shoulders. I am Margaret, a widow who has lived most of her life with simplicity and resilience. When the old bus finally stopped at the stop, I breathed a sigh of relief, as if an invisible burden had been lifted from my back. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the foliage, creating long streaks of light on the familiar cobblestone road. Willow Creek, the small town I love, was unchanged. The old diners were still there, the streets were quiet, and the peaceful, slow atmosphere that I had grown attached to all my life. The old street corner cafe still smelled of warm roasted coffee, and the Grandma Sue's cake shop still displayed fragrant cookies behind the glass. I smiled softly, feeling my heart soften in the midst of the constant, as if time had quietly stood still, waiting for me to return. I walked slowly back to my warm house, the place that used to be my home with my late husband, where we raised Daniel together. The house was small, neat, and clean, with pots of red geraniums on the porch, giving it a simple yet affectionate beauty. As soon as I unlocked the door, the familiar smell of old wood and books filled the air, welcoming me like a gentle hug. I placed my old but sturdy bag on the floor, took a deep breath, letting the silence and peace seep into every corner of my soul. But the sense of peace didn't last long. Out of habit, I went to the old landline to check my voicemail. There was a beep, followed by the young voice of a girl from the book club, reminding me about next week's meeting. Okay, I muttered, making a mental note. Then another message, this time a monotone, mechanical voice from the bank. Confirmation that your mortgage payment for X Main Street has been made. I recognized it. It was Daniel's home address. A gentle but persistent feeling of unease crept into my heart. For years, I had been paying Daniel's mortgage regularly, a heavy burden for a widow like me. I had always told myself that it was my way of providing stability for my son, so that he would not have to worry about a roof over his head. Daniel was grown up with his own family, but somehow that burden still rested on my shoulders. Shouldn't he be able to take care of himself by now? I tried to push that thought away, to trust him. But the seed of worry had quietly sprouted, and I knew that one day it would grow into a towering tree, obscuring the peaceful sky that I had tried to keep to myself. The next morning, with thoughts of Daniel and the mortgage heavy on my mind, I decided to pay my son and his family a visit. Daniel's house in the suburb of Willow Creek was much larger than my own, but as I pulled into the driveway, a bad feeling hit me. The front lawn was overgrown, knee-high, leaves littered the paved walkway, and a few old toys lay scattered on the porch, untended. The windows were covered in dust, and no one came to greet me when I pulled up, a scene that was a stark contrast to the neatness and coziness of my home. I got out of the car, trying to hide the sigh that was welling up. When I knocked, it took a moment for Daniel to answer. My son, a man in his mid-40s, looked more haggard and tired than I'd expected. The dark circles under his eyes were obvious, and he avoided my gaze. "Mom," he said nonchalantly, then reluctantly stepped back to let me in. Inside, the house was even worse than it looked. There were piles of old newspapers on the coffee table, and a stale smell of food lingered in the air, making it hard to breathe. In the corner of the living room, I found my little niece Sophie, only 7 years old, sitting huddled on the old sofa. Her eyes were big and round, but she looked at me timidly. Her chestnut brown hair was a bit messy, her clothes were worn and wrinkled, and she was not cared for at all. Sophie was hugging a stuffed animal that was so old and faded that its original shape was almost unrecognizable. When I called softly, "Sophie, it's your granddaughter," she only raised her head slightly, her eyes sparkling with fear, then drooped down like a crushed flower petal. My heart sank. I remembered Sophie as a lively, bright child, and now she seemed like a shadow, At that moment, Laura, Daniel's wife and Sophie's stepmother, emerged from the kitchen. She was a sharp looking woman, but her eyes and demeanor were cold and somewhat arrogant. "Hello, Margaret," she said, her voice lacking any intimacy, and she immediately turned to her two stepchildren, Ethan and Chloe. Ethan, 15, was staring at his phone with an indifferent expression. Chloe, 13, was posing in front of the mirror, looking smug. "Ethan, Chloe, did you have fun today?" Laura asked them in a gentle, affectionate voice, completely different from the way she had greeted me. I watched intently. Laura handed Ethan a brand new tablet, then turned to compliment Chloe on her new dress. Meanwhile, Sophie sat quietly in the corner, unnoticed, unwelcome, not even given a warm look. When Sophie accidentally dropped her crayon on the floor, I saw Laura give her an annoyed look, as if waiting for a reason to scold her. The obvious favoritism made my heart ache. Sophie's closed off, Laura's coldness, and the way she treated Ethan and Chloe were so unfairly made me start to feel a growing unease. Daniel remained silent, avoiding my gaze, not making any gestures of concern for his own daughter. I began to wonder, what was really going on in this house? Was Sophie living in love or just existing in oblivion? The worry was growing, like a seed of unease had been planted, and now it was starting to sprout. I could feel a cold, vague aura enveloping this space, and I knew I could no longer ignore it. My anxiety grew as I tried to dig deeper into Sophie's world, the world she was living in secret. I stayed at Daniel's house longer than I had expected, trying to observe every gesture, every glance, hoping to find some clue. But the atmosphere was still thick with tension, making every word seem strained. Daniel seemed to have lost the light in his eyes. He was silent most of the time, occasionally interjecting reluctantly, as if he were just tolerating my presence. Laura, on the other hand, maintained her haughty exterior, although sometimes, when talking about her two stepchildren, I noticed that she was more relaxed and excited. I took the initiative to start a conversation, deciding to go straight to the point that was bothering me. "Laura, how's Sophie? Is she having fun at school?" I asked, trying to make my voice as light and natural as possible. She answered vaguely, almost without thinking. "Oh, that girl. She's a bit unapproachable, Miss Margaret. Her teacher said she's quiet and doesn't play with anyone." I frowned. The Sophie I knew was a cheerful, smart girl, always smiling and chatting. "Really? She's smart. How are her grades?" I asked again, suddenly feeling doubtful. "She's doing okay at school, but how can she fit in like that, Ethan?" Laura turned to smile brightly at Ethan, who was engrossed in his phone. Ethan just shrugged, not looking up. The inconsistency in Laura's words made me uneasy. A good student but unable to fit in? Something didn't make sense. The conversation took a turn when Laura started rambling on about the new gadgets Ethan and Chloe had just bought. Chloe's been asking for the new phone, and Ethan keeps talking about the game console. It's expensive, but what can you do? They're kids. She laughed contentedly. Then, without anyone asking, Laura went on to tell me about their recent family trip to Florida. That trip cost a fortune. Daniel kept complaining about not having enough money, but I said, "Go ahead, the money will come. You have to let the kids enjoy themselves, don't you think?" she said, boasting, not realizing that her words were rubbing salt in my wounds. I didn't respond, just listened silently, the cold numbers and calculations slowly forming in my head. Daniel had a steady job but a modest income. I knew that. So where did they get the money for luxury shopping and vacations? I remembered the mortgage I was quietly paying off each month to help my son. Was Daniel taking advantage of me? Or was there something else, something shady going on behind the unusual spending? While Laura was talking, Sophie sat quietly in the corner of the living room, doodling on an old piece of paper, the faded stuffed animal still in her small arms. She looked heartbreakingly lonely, as if she were trying to shrink herself away from anyone who might notice her existence. When I walked closer, Sophie quickly stopped, hid her drawing, blinked and lowered her eyes, avoiding my gaze. The gesture made my heart clench. She was clearly afraid, living on guard, lacking a sense of security. It was as if Sophie was constantly straining to be invisible. The pieces began to come together in my head. An outcast child, a biased stepmother, a silent father, and a seemingly comfortable life that was riddled with insecurities. The shady spending, the coldness toward Sophie, the lavishness toward Ethan and Chloe, all of it began to paint a grim picture. What had initially felt like unease had now turned into genuine worry. I had no doubt that something was wrong with Sophie, and that there was a well-kept secret in this house. I knew I couldn't continue to ignore it. Something had to change, and if no one else would, then I would have to do it. My anxiety had been growing heavier, like a stone in my chest that afternoon. I wanted to do something, anything, to make Sophie feel that she wasn't alone. Before dinner, I called her gently. She was still huddled in the corner, doodling on the floor with a worn-out crayon. "Sophie, come here for a moment," I said softly, trying to make my voice soft and reassuring. She looked up, her big round eyes still shy, but then she stood up slowly and walked toward me. I took a small box from my bag. Inside was a handcrafted silver star pendant, sparkling softly in the yellow light. It was a gift I had prepared in advance, a small symbol of protection and hope. "This is for you, Sophie," I said, opening the box to show her the beautiful necklace. "It will protect you and remind you that you are a star, wherever you are." Sophie stared at the gift, her eyes slightly surprised, then turned to me hesitantly, almost fearfully. She touched the pendant but did not take it, as if it were more than she was allowed to expect. Perhaps she had lived so long feeling abandoned that even a small gift seemed too foreign. I gently placed the gift in her hand. Sophie held it tightly, as if afraid it would disappear if she let go. At that moment, for the first time, I witnessed my nephew receiving something specifically for him in this house, and my heart ached. Dinner that night was a heavy ordeal. The family gathered around the table, but the atmosphere was so cold that every word seemed frozen. Daniel and Laura kept talking about upcoming fun and shopping plans for Ethan and Chloe. "Are we going to town next week, Ethan? I saw a new coat that would look great on you," Laura said excitedly. "And Chloe, I saw that dress you liked the other day." They talked passionately about their trip to Florida, about the expensive gifts, but Sophie was completely ignored. She sat quietly, a shadow chewing her food slowly and carefully, as if the slightest noise would bring her reprimand. I noticed that Daniel didn't ask her a single question, not about her studies, not about how her day had gone. It was as if he didn't see his daughter's presence right in front of him. Laura was even worse. When Sophie accidentally spilled some water on the table, she immediately glared, her voice snapping. "This girl is so clumsy." Daniel only added a bland scolding. "Sophie, what are you doing? Be careful." I saw Sophie's eyes welling up, but she bit her lip, her small shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back her tears. Sitting there, watching Sophie try to shrink away, as if to disappear from this world, I felt a simmering anger rising inside me. My fear had become reality. Sophie was being abandoned, not physically, but in every look, every word. Daniel was cold, Laura was cruel, and I, the mother who had sacrificed everything for Daniel, had become the financial wallet for him to live a selfish life, at the same time pushing my own daughter into the darkness of hurt. In that moment, I knew I could no longer remain silent. I had become accustomed to being the forgiving mother, forgiving, protecting, and hoping over and over again. But now I was no longer that mother. I was a woman whose trust had been betrayed, and a grandmother watching her granddaughter being crushed in silence. A fire of anger burned inside me, burning away my resignation. The pain transformed into a steely resolve. I would not stand by and watch. I would act. For Sophie, for justice, and for myself. That night, I could not sleep. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Sophie's timid, evasive gaze, Laura's cold voice, and Daniel's cruel, indifferent expression kept replaying in my mind like an endless rewind. The next morning, I was still in Daniel's house, and I knew I couldn't avoid this confrontation any longer. I sat in the living room, holding an old book in my hand, trying to keep my mind calm. But all my efforts were in vain. The sound from the kitchen kept pulling me back to the uneasy reality. Then suddenly, a loud shout rang out, tearing the early morning air. "You spilled everything! Are you blind?" Daniel's voice was full of anger. Immediately after, Ethan and Chloe's giggles rang out like small, cold knives. A fire of anger flared up inside me. I immediately stood up, without thinking, without hesitation, and walked quickly to the kitchen. The scene before my eyes made my blood boil in waves. Sophie was kneeling on the floor, clumsily wiping away the spilled water, her small shoulders shaking, and her eyes filled with tears. Daniel stood with his arms folded behind him, his eyes filled with anger and coldness. Ethan and Chloe stood in the corner, laughing gleefully, as if Sophie's misfortune was a pastime. "Daniel, what are you doing?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the kitchen, sharp as a knife cutting through the emotionless fog. My eyes were fixed on my son, full of anger. "You let her be ridiculed and belittled in your own home? And those two, Ethan, Chloe, who do you think you are, laughing at your sister like that?" Daniel stood frozen, clearly surprised by my sudden appearance. He stammered, trying to defend himself. "Mom, what are you talking about? If he spilled the water, I have to teach him a lesson." I didn't bother listening to those cheap excuses. All the anger, disappointment, and hurt that had been building up for so long now burst forth. "You're not the Daniel I knew," I said, each word like a hammer blow to his wall of indifference. "And Sophie, your daughter, she's getting hurt every day. She's being made to do everything while the other two are enjoying the things she should have had a share of. She's a child, Daniel. A child who needs to be loved, not punished for being different." I pointed at Ethan and Chloe, who had started to back away, frightened by my outburst. They looked at each other, bewildered, realizing that the joke had stopped being a joke. Laura heard the noise and entered the kitchen. Her face was frowning, clearly annoyed. "Miss Margaret, please don't interfere with our child's upbringing. Sophie is really slow. She needs to be taught to become a good person." "Slow?" I spun around to face Laura, my voice chilling. "No, you're the one who needs to learn how to be a human again. Sophie is much smarter than she thinks. It's because of looks like yours, the contempt, the scorn, the indifference, that she's withdrawn like this. I raised Daniel, I gave him everything, and now he's destroying his own child, and I won't stand by and watch any longer." The argument broke out immediately. Daniel struggled with nonsensical reasons. Laura argued back. But I didn't give in. Enough. I was tired of the lies, the hypocrisy, the cheap facade of happy family. I said it all, one by one, what I had seen, the worries I had tried to suppress, and the disappointment they had worked so hard to build in me. They accused me of breaking up their family, but they had broken it long ago, when they chose to hurt an innocent child. I knew that from this moment on, my relationship with Daniel would never be the same again. But I also knew one thing. Sophie's safety and happiness were more important than any blood relationship. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating atmosphere and a silence that stretched like an unspoken sentence. After the tense confrontation that day, I decided not to stay another minute in Daniel's house. I drove back to my peaceful little house, which had been my spiritual refuge. My emotions were still churning inside, anger, disappointment, but above all, a lingering grief for Sophie. She had endured too long the cold indifference of those closest to her. The next morning, I called Daniel. My voice was calm but uncompromising. Mommy wants to take Sophie out for a day. She needs some air, some time away from that stuffy atmosphere. Daniel, perhaps still angry after the argument, or simply wanting to avoid my scrutiny, reluctantly agreed. When Sophie arrived at my house, she came in timidly, her eyes downcast, not daring to look me in the eye. My heart sank. I tried to create the warmest, most soothing atmosphere possible. I prepared a full breakfast, all the things I knew she loved: pancakes with maple syrup, sunny side up eggs, and a glass of cold milk. Sophie ate carefully, in small bites, but I saw the light in her eyes as she tasted her first pancake, a light so fragile and precious. After breakfast, I took Sophie to the small garden behind the house. Although not large, the garden was carefully tended by me, with all kinds of blooming flowers and lovely vegetable beds. I placed a set of paintbrushes and a box of colorful watercolors in front of her. "Let's paint, Sophie. What do you like to paint?" I asked, then sat down next to her on the cool stone bench. At first, she only drew faint, trembling strokes, like her withdrawn soul. But I took my time, patiently guiding her step by step: how to mix colors, how to draw soft petals, birds on branches, or even the funny animals she often mentioned. Gradually, her hands relaxed. The strokes became lively, natural, and then, like magic, I heard a giggle as light as a breeze as I drew a dog with oversized ears. We continued gardening together. I taught Sophie how to identify weeds, how to dig the soil, how to water the plants just enough. She loved getting her hands dirty, the soft petals touching her skin. I told her stories about Daniel's past, his pranks, the times he almost fell off an apple tree, or how he once hid candy under his pillow and forgot about it until ants crawled all over his bed. Sophie listened attentively, her eyes wide with curiosity and delight. She smiled, asking me in a chirpy voice about the father she had only known through cold faces. Looking at that smile, I felt something deep. Finally, Sophie had a moment to truly be a child. No fear, no restraint, just pure joy, innocence. As dusk began to fall, the two of us sat side by side on the porch bench. Before us was a sky of brilliant oranges, purples, and yellows, a picture only nature could create. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. I took a deep breath, feeling a rare sense of peace. "Do you want to go home, Sophie?" I asked softly, my eyes still on the sky. She bowed her head, her small hands clasped in her lap. I, I don't want to go," she whispered, almost a whisper. I'm not welcome there." Tears silently fell down her cheeks, even though she tried to hide them. That simple yet painful sentence pierced my heart, like a needle piercing through the shell of endurance. I pulled Sophie into my arms, hugging her small body that was shaking every time. "It's okay, Sophie. I'm here. I won't let you suffer any more." I promised myself silently, an oath that didn't need to be spoken, but was as firm as a rock. From that moment on, I knew I wouldn't let her go back to that place. I was willing to do anything, sacrifice anything, to give Sophie a proper childhood. She deserved to be loved, to live a decent life, and I would be the one to protect that to the end. After that day with Sophie, I knew more than ever that I could no longer wait. Her weak confession, her frightened eyes, and the fragility of her every move, all of it echoed in my mind like a sad song that never stopped. I had to act, and to do that, I needed the law. The next morning, I called Thomas, my family lawyer for many years. He was a gray-haired man with glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his face stern but always steadfast and trustworthy. Thomas had handled everything from my husband's will to his estate and had never let me down. I knew that at this point I could trust him. I drove to Thomas's office, a modest, somewhat old but neat place located in the heart of Willow Creek. Stepping inside, I immediately felt the quiet atmosphere, as if every wall, every bookshelf was a reminder of the care and seriousness that the legal profession requires. Thomas greeted me with a light handshake and his usual polite smile, then invited me to sit in the familiar leather chair in front of his desk. "Hello, Margaret. What brings you to see me so early?" he asked, his tone calm, unhurried, as if he was ready to listen to everything. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the jumble of thoughts that were dancing around in my head. "Thomas, I need you to do me a very important favor," I began, my voice thick with exhaustion and frustration. "I want to stop making the mortgage payments on Daniel's house." Thomas listened quietly as I told him the whole story, from Daniel and Laura's situation to Sophie's predicament. I told him about Daniel's cruel neglect of his own daughter, Laura's insensitivity, and Sophie's gut-wrenching sense of shame at living in a loveless home. I didn't forget to mention the questionable extravagance, Ethan and Chloe's brand new gadgets, and a recent trip to Florida, which were far beyond Daniel's means, given his income. Thomas listened attentively, nodding along to my story, occasionally jotting notes in his leather notebook. When I finished, he paused, then pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Margaret, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice low and serious. "When I checked the financial records on the house, I discovered that Daniel had secretly taken out a secondary mortgage, a second loan, without telling you." I froze. Betrayal spread through me, cold and numb. "A second loan?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What did he do with it?" Thomas sighed, his brows furrowing. "Based on the transactions I've reviewed, it appears that all of that money was used by Daniel for personal use, from luxury purchases to expensive vacations. It's clear that he was trying to maintain a lifestyle beyond his means, without regard for the long-term financial consequences, or even your own sacrifice." The truth hit me like a slap in the face. This was no longer irresponsible. It was outright deception. Daniel had abused my trust, using my financial support for his family as a tool to support a life of meaningless luxury, while his own daughter was abandoned, alone and hurting every day. Anger welled up inside me, but I held it back. I swallowed the fire that was burning inside me, turning it into steel, into unshakable determination. "So, Thomas, what can you do for me?" I asked, my voice hard, each word as hard as nails. "I want to stop the payments immediately, and I want Daniel to be held accountable for everything he has done." Thomas nodded. He explained the legal options before him. He could prepare a formal document notifying the bank that I would stop paying the mortgage. At the same time, he suggested starting a review of Daniel's finances and, if necessary, taking legal action regarding Sophie's custody. I nodded without hesitation. "Do whatever it takes, Thomas," I said, my voice firm. "I don't just want to stop supporting him. I want Daniel to face the consequences of his selfishness, his lies, and his irresponsibility. And most of all, I want to protect Sophie. I will do everything I can to make sure she never has to go back to that house, that place of coldness and hurt." I left Thomas's office with a heavy heart. The pain of my son's betrayal still weighed heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But amid all that, I felt a small sense of relief. I was finally going to act. I had the truth, I had a plan, and I was ready to fight. Not just for Sophie, but for myself, for the values I believed in, for the love I had given away for so long, unrequited. A few days after my meeting with Attorney Thomas, I received official notice from the bank confirming that the mortgage payments on Daniel's house had been suspended. But instead of the relief I had hoped for, I was weighed down by a simmering tension. I knew that a confrontation was inevitable, and I knew that I had to tell Daniel in person. I couldn't let him know in a careless letter or a quick phone call. I wanted to look my son in the eye and show him the seriousness of what was happening. I arrived at Daniel's house one evening in the twilight. The atmosphere in the house was as tense and chaotic as before, as if chaos had become an inescapable part of their lives. Daniel and Laura were sitting in front of the television, the loud laughter from the show echoing through the room, as indifferent as their lives. When I entered, they both turned to look at me, a flicker of surprise in their eyes, and then the tension that filled the room. "Can I talk to you alone, Daniel?" I asked, my tone firm, leaving no room for refusal. I placed the envelope containing the documents from Attorney Thomas on the coffee table, right in front of Daniel. Daniel looked at the envelope, then at me, a look of confusion on his face. "What happened, Mom?" "I'm here to announce that as of next month, I'm officially stopping the mortgage payments on this house," I said. No beating around the bush, no soft spokenness. I watched Daniel's reaction closely. At first, he was stunned. Then very quickly, he broke into a half smile, full of defiance. "Are you trying to scare me again?" Daniel said, his voice teasing and full of self-satisfaction. "You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't let your son lose his home. You would never abandon me." He was used to me forgiving, being humble, taking the fall. In Daniel's eyes, I was a safety net that never broke, a crutch he could exploit endlessly. "This time is different, Daniel," I replied, my voice cold as steel. "I have thought it through. This is not a threat, but a carefully considered decision. You have taken advantage of my sacrifice for too long, spending lavishly, living carelessly, without regard for the consequences. And worst of all, you have left your little girl Sophie alone, cold, unloved." Laura noticed the tension and stepped forward, her voice harsh. "Miss Margaret, what are you doing? Are you trying to destroy this family?" I didn't look at her, didn't respond. I continued, addressing Daniel. "I know you secretly took out a second mortgage on this house. You didn't tell me, you lied. And that money, you didn't use to take care of your family or Sophie. You used it to squander on expensive things, on frivolous vacations, while your own daughter was treated like an extra." Daniel paled. His arrogant smile vanished, replaced by anger and worry. "Mom, you can't do this. I'm your son," he shouted, standing up, his eyes bulging with excitement. "This is my house. You have no right to decide." "I have the right of a mother who has paid the debts her child could not bear," I said, my voice strangely calm. "And more importantly, I have the right of a grandmother who is trying to protect the future of a granddaughter who has been abandoned by her own parents." The air in the room was thick. Daniel and Laura hurled harsh words at me, blaming me for destroying their family, for making them lose everything. They screamed, scolded, tried to shake me, but I would not give in. I was no longer the soft, forgiving, backing down mother I had been. I had had enough. I had seen the truth, and the truth made me unable to stay silent. I left that house screaming and saying vile things, but inside I was undaunted. I had chosen my path, and I knew it was the right one. No more blind forgiveness. No more unconditional salvation. I didn't do this out of anger. I did it for Sophie, because that child deserved to live in a better world, where love wasn't something to beg. I chose the quietest and harshest form of revenge, letting Daniel face the consequences of his actions. And in that determination, I found peace, not for myself, but for Sophie's future. 2 months later, my life was as calm as a lake, but I knew that somewhere out there, a real storm was brewing in Daniel's life. I kept in regular contact with Attorney Thomas, and he told me that the bank had officially served a foreclosure notice on Daniel's house. I didn't feel any sense of satisfaction or satisfaction. Instead, I felt a dull, creeping sadness, like the cold mist of early winter, a sadness for a son who had driven himself into a dead end. Then one day, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was weak and shaky, a far cry from his usual arrogant, domineering self. Mom, the bank is threatening to foreclose on my house, Daniel said, his voice cracking with desperation. They've sent the papers. Mom, can you lend me some money to pay for the move? I promise I'll pay. I swear it. I was silent for a few seconds, then took a deep breath to calm myself. My heart was clenched, aching, but I knew that if I gave in now, everything I had done would be for nothing. Son, I will no longer fund this lifestyle, I replied, my voice firm but not cold. However, I want to see Sophie. I need to know how she is doing. If you really want to talk, let me see her first. Daniel hesitated in silence, as if he was torn between pride and despair. Finally, he reluctantly agreed. Perhaps at that moment, he also understood that he had nothing left to bargain for. I arrived at Daniel's house that afternoon. As soon as I stood outside the gate, I was struck by the devastation. The house was in disrepair. The lawn was overgrown as if it had never been tended, and cardboard boxes were piled on the porch, a sign of a hasty and chaotic move. When I stepped inside, it felt like I had stepped into a battlefield that had just been destroyed. Trash was everywhere, furniture was strewn everywhere, and the air was thick with a suffocating, oppressive smell. From the kitchen came the sounds of Daniel and Laura arguing loudly. Plates were smashing, screams were screaming, and their marriage was falling apart right before my eyes. I hurried to find Sophie. After a while of walking through the messy rooms, I finally found her. She was huddled in a corner of the living room, surrounded by a pile of old, discarded furniture. She was much thinner, her face was haggard, and her eyes were filled with a deep, heartbreaking sadness. Sophie was quietly stuffing her few belongings into an old, faded canvas bag, probably all the possessions she was allowed to bring with her. In her arms, she still held tightly to her old stuffed animal, her only remaining friend in this broken world. In the opposite corner of the room, Ethan and Chloe were engrossed in a video game, headphones on, completely ignoring Sophie's presence. They didn't even look up when I entered, as if she had never existed in this family. That moment hit me like a cold knife. Sophie, a child of only 7, was bearing it all alone. The broken family, the cruel indifference of her relatives, and her aimless departure. While her parents and half-siblings were still arguing and worrying about themselves, no one reached out to help this child. No one comforted her. No one asked. No one listened. She was completely lost, abandoned in her own home. Daniel emerged from the kitchen after his argument with Laura, his face drawn and tired, his chin stubbled. I looked him straight in the eye, my gaze as cold as the winter morning dew. I'm not giving you another penny, Daniel, I said clearly without wavering. Not a cent. Daniel slumped into his chair, his shoulders shaking. He didn't say a word, didn't protest, didn't beg. Perhaps, in that moment, he also understood that all doors were closed. Despair was evident on his face. But I didn't regret it. The image of Sophie sitting huddled in the middle of that chaos was engraved in my mind, like a final mark, helping me to be confident in my decision. I had given Daniel too many chances, had sacrificed to the end, and now it was time for me to stand up for Sophie, for her future, no matter how much maternal love I had to exchange. I turned and walked away, leaving behind a fallen man and a house that was gradually sinking into chaotic darkness with no way out. The next morning, as I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, my hand gently cupping a steaming cup of tea, the phone rang. The name on the screen made me freeze for a moment. Laura. I hesitated before answering. Her voice on the other end of the line was no longer arrogant, cold, or sharp as usual, but instead tired, worried, and that unmistakable undertone, calculating. Margaret, Laura tried to keep her voice soft, though she couldn't hide her hesitation. We're really having a hard time. Daniel and I, we're separated. A flash of surprise passed through my mind, though not entirely. I had seen the rift, but I had not expected it to fall apart so quickly. Laura continued, this time lowering her voice, as if making a suggestion hidden in her humility. Could you take in Sophie temporarily? We really have nowhere to go, and if Sophie were with you, maybe, it would be easier to support us a little, financially. I sat up straight, my fingers lightly gripping the handle of my teacup. Her voice was soft, but her intention was as sharp as a knife, hoping I would open my wallet again, this time through Sophie. I took a deep breath, fighting down the rising feeling of contempt. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I'll get Sophie, Laura, I said slowly, each word distinct, my voice calm but firm as steel. I'll take care of her, but there's not a penny coming to you or to Daniel. Not a penny. I paused, then added, to let her know there was no turning back. And I'll file for temporary guardianship for Sophie. She needs a real home, a safe, stable place, something you two haven't been able to give her. The other end of the line went dead silent. I could almost picture Laura's face, her lips pressed together, her jaw set, her eyes darting around in a calculating way. She had no choice, and we both knew it. Fine, Laura said finally, her voice almost a hiss through her teeth. Then you come get him. That afternoon, I returned to Daniel's house, a place once filled with hope, now the hollow shell of a shattered dream. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had left or was hiding from responsibility. Laura was the one who answered the door, her face gaunt, her eyes dark, her gaze vacant. Beside her, Sophie stood silently, clutching a small canvas bag and an old stuffed animal that had faded with age. She looked at me, her eyes still suspicious and wary, as if afraid that anyone might abandon her again. There was no goodbye hug from her mother, no words of warning, no smile, not even a loving glance. Laura turned away as if Sophie were a piece of luggage to be delivered, nothing more. I walked over, bent down, and gently took Sophie into my arms. Her body was thin and fragile like a sheet of paper. I hugged her tightly and whispered in her ear, "Welcome home, Sophie." On the way home, she didn't say anything. She just looked out the window silently. I held her little hand. It was cold, but I didn't pull it away. When we got home, I led Sophie into the room I'd spent the week preparing. It was small but cozy, with pale cream wallpaper, a small bed with clean sheets, a few carefully chosen children's books, and a new teddy bear on the pillow. Nothing fancy, just a sense of being appreciated, a luxury Sophie had never had. Sophie walked in, as if she were entering another world. She put down her bag and sat down on the bed, her hands gently stroking the covers. I sat down next to her, took out a book of fairy tales, and began to read, in a slow, pictorial voice. Gradually, her shoulders relaxed. She no longer sat as stiffly as she had this afternoon. When the princess was rescued from the tower, Sophie leaned her head slightly against me, her eyes half closed. For the first time in a long time, I think, she felt truly safe. I held her gently, feeling her steady breathing against my shoulder. A sense of peace spread through me, like sunlight filtering through the clouds after a long storm. I knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but now we had begun, and this time I would not let Sophie walk alone. The months Sophie lived with me completely repainted the picture of the lonely life of the two of us. The small house that used to only echo with the ticking of the clock and the quiet footsteps of old age now bustled with the clear laughter and bustling rhythm of a child. Under the gentle sunlight of unconditional love, Sophie was like a closed flower bud, watered after a long drought. She gradually blossomed, shining and fragrant. The girl who used to be shy, curled up like a leaf rolling in the wind, was now different. She was confident, active, her eyes sparkling every time she told me interesting things in class, or excitedly showed me a clumsy but colorful hand-drawn picture full of hope. She followed me to the garden, hoeing the flower beds. She read books beside me, and we spent hours playing simple games filled with laughter, sighs of relief, and sometimes even moments of silence. Seeing Sophie change day by day, my heart became more determined. I knew that I could no longer let her future be as uncertain or fragile as before. I could not let those who had abandoned her, especially Daniel and Laura, have the chance to hurt her again. It was time for me to rearrange everything, to leave behind something more solid than property, an anchor for Sophie to cling to in the storms of life. I made an appointment to meet with Thomas again. As I sat before him in the familiar smell of old paper and wood, I said without hesitation, "Thomas, I want to amend my will." My voice was firm, without a trace of hesitation. "I want to set up a trust for Sophie. You will be the custodian. I want her to have a solid foundation to move forward in life, one that no one can touch or take advantage of, not Daniel or anyone else. I've lost so much, but this time I'm not going to lose any more." Thomas was silent for a moment, then nodded in understanding. "I understand what you mean, Margaret. This is a strong decision, and a loving one. I will make sure it is done exactly as you wish." He explained the mechanics of the trust, how it would be held in strict confidence until Sophie was an adult, and no one would be able to siphon or tamper with it. Listening to him, I felt like a huge boulder had been lifted off my shoulders. Everything was finally falling into place. But somehow, Daniel had found out about my will change. Either Thomas had to disclose it indirectly under legal requirements, or Daniel had found out himself. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice came through the receiver like a storm, angry, chaotic, and uncontrolled. "What the hell are you doing? You can't do this to me. I'm your son. You're betraying me," he screamed, as if I had betrayed my own blood. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath to calm myself. I had been waiting for this confrontation. "No, Daniel," I replied, my voice even but firm. "I didn't betray anyone. I was just doing the right thing, the thing you should have done a long time ago. I gave you so many chances. I gave you my life. And in return, you betrayed that trust. You lied. You took advantage. And most importantly, you abandoned your own daughter." I paused, as if to engrave each word into his mind. "Sophie is my future, someone I must protect to the end. If you do not fulfill your duty as a father, then do not expect to retain any rights from me. The will is mine, and I will leave it to the rightful owner, not because of blood, but because of love." The other end of the line was silent. There was only a gasp, then the call ended with an abrupt hang up. I put the phone down on the table, feeling no regret, no anger, no sadness, just the peace of someone who had finally cleared up the mess of a lifetime. Because I know the sweetest revenge lies not in inflicting pain on the one who caused it, but in rebuilding the good that was once destroyed. And for me, protecting Sophie is the strongest way to end all injustice. Time passed, quietly, like the pages of a book being turned by the wind, and my life with Sophie gradually entered a peaceful orbit. The small house that was used to solitude now became a real home. Meals with laughter, evenings with the study light from Sophie's room, and gentle Sundays with the smell of baking bread wafting from the kitchen. Life seemed to have healed the wounds of the painful years. Daniel, after the confrontation over the will, disappeared for a while. I wasn't surprised. He was suffering the consequences of his own choices. I didn't look for him, nor did I mention it. Everyone has a limit to their tolerance, and I knew that if I continued to save him, this time it would be Sophie who would be pushed off the cliff. A few months later, as the autumn leaves began to color the backyard, Daniel returned unexpectedly. He appeared on a gray afternoon, the wind blowing like an omen. The door opened, and I saw a strange Daniel, haunted, ragged, and broken. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled, his eyes were sunken. The last remnants of his former arrogant self were a shabby shadow. Laura had left him, I knew, and now he had nowhere to turn. Mother. His voice was hoarse, like someone lost in the desert. I have nowhere else to go. Laura left me. I'm practically a vagabond. Can you let me come back here for a while? I promise I'll make things right. I'll find a job. I'll take care of you. And Sophie. I stood still, looking at the son who had once been my whole world, now like a stranger. There was no more anger in my heart. There was no more hatred. There was only a dull sadness, like the sound of a piano playing in an empty room. I felt sorry for him, but it was no longer a love that could be accompanied by sacrifice. It was only pity for a man who had refused salvation when it still existed. Daniel, I said, my voice neither cold nor soft, just the firmness of someone who has weathered many storms and knows what to hold on to. You can't stay here, not because I'm angry, but because I can no longer put Sophie's life at risk. This is her safe place, the home she's come to trust. I can't let the uncertainty return. Daniel froze, then his eyes changed, from pleading to anger, a weak, desperate anger, like a cornered animal. You'll regret it, he screamed. You have no right. I'll sue you. I'll get Sophie back. Who do you think you are to keep her like this? I stood still, not moving. The court will not judge by blood, Daniel, I replied, looking straight at him. The court will look at actions, at facts. You abandoned her, lied, and abused her trust. You have no right to ask for anything more. Daniel stared at me, as if he couldn't believe that the mother who had always stood by him was gone. But I was no longer the resigned mother I had been. I was the grandmother who had learned to protect the innocent child that others had abandoned. In the end, Daniel didn't say another word. He just stood there for a few seconds, then turned and walked away, his lonely back blending into the dark afternoon. The door closed behind him, and I felt a sense of relief creep into my heart. Not because I had kicked someone out of the house, but because I had finally protected the peace of the person I loved most. After that, Daniel still came to see Sophie a few times. At first, I let it happen. I didn't want to cut off all contact, but the visits became less frequent. When he did, he would just sit there, staring at his phone or staring at her from afar, like a stranger lost in old memories. He didn't ask her questions, didn't play with her. And then Sophie noticed. At first, I saw her eyes waiting. Every time she heard the doorbell, her little heart would flutter with hope. But every time Daniel made that hope melt like ice in the sun. And then, one day, I saw Sophie sitting silently in the corner of the room, not even bothering to look up when her father left. She understood. She no longer expected anything. And I saw that, instead of falling apart, Sophie became strong. Not the strong way an adult does, but the quiet resilience of a sprout against the wind. I watched Daniel walk out the gate, his eyes no longer blaming. There was only a final letting go. I had done everything a mother could do, but now I was no longer the mother of a lost child. I was the grandmother of a child in need of a right path, and this time I would not lose my way again. It has been a year since Sophie came to live with me, and since then, our lives have brightened. My little house has become more than just a shelter. It has become a real home, a nursery full of dreams and hopes for Sophie. She has changed dramatically, not only physically, but also mentally. The traces of fear and reserve have now given way to a radiant, strong, and confident girl. At school, Sophie was a shining star. I was proud of her academic achievements, but even more so of her extracurricular activities and her incredible ability to fit in. Teachers often called or wrote to compliment her on her intelligence, diligence, and outgoing spirit. Sophie also found a new passion, the violin. At first, the sounds from the violin were awkward, but now each melody she played reverberated enchantedly throughout the house, as gentle and pure as her soul. I still remember the look of excitement in Sophie's eyes when she first touched the violin, her eyes shining with a tiny universe of curiosity and hope. Now, each piece she plays is a declaration of rebirth and freedom. Every afternoon after school, Sophie would rush into the house, hug me, and chatter about her day, the new friends she made, the exciting lessons she had, and the little dreams she was nurturing. I listened to her with all my attention and love, always encouraging her every step of the way on her journey to adulthood. On weekends, we often wander around Willow Creek together, walking in the park, reading in the library, or just sitting quietly by the river, listening to the water and the birds. I continue to nurture my granddaughter's love of learning. I recently planned a special trip for the summer to Washington, D.C. "We're going to visit great museums, Sophie," I said, my voice full of excitement. "You'll see so many amazing things, works of art, historical landmarks. You'll broaden your horizons, learn about the world." Sophie jumped up and down with joy, her eyes lighting up, and she began to doodle all the things she wanted to see on the trip. She already had a long list of museums and landmarks in mind. Looking at Sophie's innocent smile, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction well up in my heart. All the pain, betrayal, and burden of the past years seemed to melt away. I chose love and justice for Sophie instead of blindly clinging to toxic family obligations. I took revenge not with hatred, but by building a bright future for the child I loved most. Where love and kindness were the solid foundation, my life found new meaning, an ideal that was more beautiful than anything else. Daniel is still out there. Sometimes I hear about him, that Laura is gone forever, that he is struggling alone. But I no longer feel guilty or remorseful. I did what I could. I made the right choice, not just for Sophie, but for myself. Sophie and I sat together by the window, where the bright sunlight flooded the small garden. Birds chirped, and a cool breeze gently blew through the leaves, carrying the scent of life. Our lives continued, full of hope and joy. This was not just a story of revenge, but an epic of love overcoming all wounds, of resurrection from the ashes, and of the peace we deserved. My journey, Margaret, has never been a bed of roses. It has been a long journey of loss, disappointment, and finally awakening. I have watched my only son spiral into selfishness and irresponsibility, turning his back on the little girl he was supposed to protect. I have experienced the pain of betrayal, realizing that Daniel took advantage of a mother's love and sacrifice. But in that darkness, Sophie was the light. I went from a widow living in memories to a strong grandmother, willing to do anything to protect my little grandchild. Every decision, from confronting Daniel to seeking legal help to choosing to cut off financial support, was the result of a loving and unyielding heart. And now, as I watch Sophie grow up, confident, radiant, and full of life, I know that it was all worth it. Her clear laughter, her violin playing, and her eyes filled with hope are the greatest rewards I could have received. I have not responded to cruelty with hatred, but with love and edification. I have created a home for Sophie, not just a shelter, but a safe place where love is always present. Life sometimes forces us to make the most painful choices to hold on to what is most precious. For me, that precious thing was Sophie. Her future? I chose love and justice, and in that choice, I found the peace I had been searching for all these years. Thank you for listening to my story.